afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another session of Room for Discussion. Today we have the honor to host the CEO of the Rabobank, the second biggest bank in the Netherlands. 8 million people in the Netherlands have this card and is one of the 30 largest banks in the entire world.
We're going to talk about his past 7 years of leading the bank. We're going to talk about sustainable finance and, of course, the financial sector and the current situation in the Ukraine. My name is Casper. This is Tim. And please welcome CEO of the Rabobank, Wiebe Draijer.
Good afternoon. Some water? I have coffee. I have a cappuccino. I don't know what you have.
I already know who's more valuable in this stage here.
Well, thanks for coming to Room for Discussion.
Yeah.
You've been here before, of course, quite some years ago. Has it changed, or does it look a little bit the same?
I think the space is the same, the couch is the same. I don't know whether the questions will be the same. But,
I hope not. Because when you came here for the first time, a couple of years ago, the Rabobank was, well, in some rough seas. The Rabobank was still dealing with the aftermath of the Libor scandal, which happened before you came in, but you had to deal with as CEO. When you came here, you talked about a culture change within the Rabobank. And what have we seen as clients of the Rabobank of this culture change within your bank?
well, that question only you can answer. But I hope. So when I joined, this is about now 7.5 years ago, there was not only the aftermath of the Libor situation, which created a sense of distrust, almost something that didn't fit the culture that the Rabobank image had, and therefore the issue was deeper than maybe you would just say, I have an issue, I manage the issue. But also, I think there was a lot of leftover work to be done on making the bank fit for the 21st century. And I think now at least 2 or 3 things have happened. One, it is fit. And when we compare ourselves to other banks in Europe, and we've recently done so, in terms of the improvements that we've made, we are in the top quartile in terms of improvements. So the bank is fit. The culture has really sunk in, so we now know why we're here. And people that work with Rabobank know why we're here, and they want to be with Rabobank because we know why we're here. And that was not the case when I joined. So I think we really made a step up. That's what I hope that people as clients also see. And I think we really made steps in terms of doing things for our mission. So we have really articulated the mission, and we're doing some unbanking type things to get there. And no doubt we'll talk about that. But I feel that we are more a societal organization with a mission that also has a banking license than a bank that tries to fit its existence into a mission.
Yeah, because
that's a profound difference if you compare ourselves with other banks.
Yes, definitely the mission-driven bank in a way. Because, well, you just mentioned this, but this question Room for Discussion, our colleagues actually asked this exact question that many years ago.
Yeah.
And back then you specifically mentioned that you wanted to be, again, the bank that's close to its clients, that is a regional partner in good and bad times, and also this force outside just being a bank.
Yeah.
Now you seem to focus more on being that force for good outside the bank.
Indeed.
Why has your focus shifted to that bit more?
I think there was also because 7.5 years ago there was a lot of work to be done to bring the bank closer to where it ought to be in the middle of society, and there was always the heritage, the origin 125 years ago of a cooperative that brought together money of richer farmers that could finance poorer farmers. It was a cooperative that was designed because banks didn't work for poor farmers. So the heritage, the herkomst, where we came from, suggested that we have something that is a bigger motive than just being a bank. And that's something that we discovered in the last 7 years. We really reignited the mission of the bank, and now we genuinely want to be a force for good that also is a bank, which is different from most banks in the world, I can tell you.
What's different from most banks in the world is you're a corporation, and
Yes.
that corporation also went on a massive change the last few years. How was the interplay between the shift from like the old structure of the corporate structure to a centralized
Yeah.
more centralized.
So now we are one cooperative. We have about 2.5 million members, 8 million clients, and those members are represented through the membership council. And the membership council is when other banks talk to their shareholders, I talk to my members, so to speak. And then the structure inside is essentially one cooperative unity with local community banks and a common organization that serves clients all over the world. And previously we were all local cooperatives that had a cooperative daughter, if you will, and I was the CEO of the daughter, and that also had an oversight role on all the local cooperative banks. Very complicated, very convoluted, very slow. That we all brought together, which was a very complicated process as well, because this was the largest merger in the country, in the history of the country, of the Netherlands. And it had to be decided by all the voting members with a more than 2/3 majority. So there was a December 3rd on, I think it was 2015, when there was a meeting between 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock at night. And there were membership councils meetings taking place in 140 places of the country. And in that 2 hours, more than 2/3 of the members needed to decide that they would give up the keys of the local cooperative bank and hand it over to the joint cooperative bank. So if you imagine that as a societal phenomenon, where organization really becomes society, this was the most complex process I've ever run in my life. And we had a bit of a Korean voting outcome of about, I think it was 79 or 89.5% yes, we want to step into this new cooperative.
So it seems like the European Union could learn something from that. Like all the small groups, like it's the European Union on steroids, basically.
I think
140.
I think you're bound to be a good politician. But I think you're right. I genuinely, if you think about the process of that kind of change, you have to spend a lot of time thinking about why are we here? Do we want to go? What is the reason for the change? So you spend a lot of time on discussing the need, and then the change goes much faster. And if I look at politics, to contrast, there's a lot of time spent on we take an easy decision and then we spend infinite time not getting it right. And so in that sense, I think it's a different way of leading, and it would be a good answer for politics as well, in my mind.
Well, when you started at Rabobank, the boardroom, looked like people like you, I would say. And quite soon after you started, the Rabobank became, in the boardroom, a much more 50-50 gender split.
Yes.
Was that important for you, and is the work done now?
It was very important to me. It still is very important to me. And when I joined, there were of the 200 leaders, there was one woman. So 200 leaders, one woman. And by now we're growing to about 40% of that 200 leaders being female, male split. And in the board we're 50%.
Because does it trickle down into the cooperative?
I think, at the bottom of the cooperative we were 50-50. And then when you go up to the middle layers it was rarely any. And now it is evenly spread, I think, across the whole bank almost. And I want to get to 50-50 male-female across all ranks and files. But it's not the only dimension of diversity that I care about. The more cultural diversity, the more, whatever, sexual orientation, religion, actually character. So be fully diverse in character is what the ultimate goal is. And I think we made great progress, but we still got way to go.
Let's turn to one of the topics that's been on all our minds in the past weeks, the situation in Ukraine with Putin's invasion. And let's say up front that, of course, first and foremost, this is a grave humanitarian tragedy. But however, we now have the opportunity to speak to you and also take a look at, what is the role and the impact on the financial sector in this crisis. Over the past weeks, we've seen that banks, at least stock-listed banks, have crashed. ING losing almost 30% or a little bit over 30% of their stock price at one point since the beginning of January. Is this a direct consequence of the war?
Absolutely. So when you take an investor point of view, you're looking at a bank and say how much of your loan book is in either Russia or Ukraine or indirectly hit by the consequences of this war. And some banks are more present in the East than others. And I think some of this stock market reaction is directly related to that. But I think also it's driven by the more broad, the general decline in stock prices of all stock-listed companies, because we feel, rightfully so, that the economy as a whole is now being hit midstrips. And so I think there's a couple of effects in that financial, but you've seen some recovery of the financial institutions already. We, as Rabobank, have been cautious in Russia up until the run-up to the war, and in Ukraine we have served some clients, but we're not massively there.
Some clients still think the FDA/Bloomberg reported 500 million, close to 500 million.
Yeah, this was a piece of really bad journalism, I must confess. But
bad journalism by Bloomberg.
Yeah, and so they scribble each other's numbers, but they really don't add up. But yes, we have clients in our loan book in Ukraine. In Russia, rarely, but we do have some leasing clients in Russia. So our leasing daughter, the Lage Landen, has a portfolio. And so you're looking at a number that represents the leasing book of the leasing daughter. But to translate that into a potential loss is a leap of faith of humongous dimensions. But it is fair that we have about that number in loans or lease outstanding. And we have to see how the war will evolve and how the general economy will evolve to see how much of that is by itself being regenerated or otherwise being covered.
So you wouldn't say that it's written off just now?
No. In fact, nothing is yet written off. It's ongoing business, but you have to think about how will you pull out.
Yeah, because one of the main investments you do also in these countries is related to agriculture.
Indeed.
When these sanctions hit and when you have these investments there, how do you make the decision of what to do, especially if these investments concern the food security of people in these other countries?
Yeah, this is a very good and a deep question, because we've been quite vocal in the last days that it's quite easy to, as all private companies have done mostly, said we're going to pull out. But the second order effects of this food crisis, the second order effect of the war is a food crisis that will hit far further than just within the region. And let me give you a couple of examples. For some agricultural commodities, you combined Ukraine and Russia represents more than half of what the world consumes. So there are some commodities that if you do what most private companies do and you pull out overnight, you actually jeopardize the food supply of a massive part of the world, and most of the supplies go to the poorer parts of the world. So a lot of the exports of Ukraine and Russia go to North Africa, to Egypt, to Middle Africa, to India. And so what you get a double effect if you cut out that supply. You actually hamper the food supply of the poorest parts of the world. And so we've been quite vocal that we need to think carefully about how we transition to a more structural supply of food to those poor parts of the world, and how we can not do it in a shock. The biggest threats are the shocks and then ultimately the non-supply. And this is something that the world needs to care about. And so we are vocal about that issue, that we need to be gradual, that we need to be responsible, while we are also determined to not stay in those regions.
So maybe an over-hasty decision by many multinational corporations?
Well, not so much in all private sector, that's just their business, but we just made the case, and this is together with most leading food companies in Europe, initiative led by Paul Polman, where we collectively said on food, when it comes to food supply, we need to be cautious, because the second order effects are actually extremely painful for the weakest parts of the world. And so we need to be careful in that decision.
So that's also the reason why your headquarters is, like not headquarters, but you still have your office in Moscow open. And
this is because this is a leasing portfolio and it's an ongoing, and therefore you need to be careful, and then you make up your mind and you don't execute overnight. I'm sure that most of these companies that have now expressed that they will step out of Russia will not do it overnight either. These things you have to do carefully. But our case has been more that collectively with other food companies we need to be very conscious about how you migrate out. We need to fix the supply to the weakest parts of the world first before you can actually shut out the light, so to speak.
But you mentioned you need to be vocal about this.
Yes.
Well, lots are vocal about oil and gas concerning this conflict. Do we need to be more vocal at the same level, or maybe even more vocal about this food security issue?
I think we should. And it's not that, for us it's not even a protection of your interests. It's driven by a deep care for being relevant in the global food supply. And so we are just about building up the momentum in Africa, that Africa can start to feed itself in the coming 10, 20 years. This will be undermined, and we've seen the Arabian Spring movement. All of that was driven off by increased food prices. And so we think that that trigger of increased food prices will have a significant effect on the stability of North Africa, and might have a significant effect on the stability of Middle Africa as well. And that's a big issue. Then we want to avoid any of that kind of instability as a result of cutting off food supplies.
Yeah, and these second order effects indeed.
Yeah.
One other thing that is, I think, important to touch on is we're talking about banks here in Europe and the Netherlands, but what about banks in Russia, for example? How are they impacted by this?
They are severely impacted already. In fact, there have been a few delinquencies of the banks. And so I don't know how they will recover this crisis. In fact, it's an irresponsible war in so many ways, but also from a stability of the financial institutions.
Yeah.
And just talking about like a big part of this instability is the sanctions that were put in place by the Western world or the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you, as a bank, all of a sudden a memo at 2 in the afternoon, you say, this is the sanction package, go do it in the next week.
Yeah.
Like, how does that process go of like, right, this is the list of...
Good question. In fact, so what we do, and here the fact that we had Corona with a crisis infrastructure starting up. So you run the bank normally as a business as usual with a board, and you have a structure, and everything is orderly. And then came in Corona, and then you set up an immediate crisis structure to deal with the immediate effects of Corona. And what we could do is, when the war started, we could reinitiate that crisis structure. So we have a 2 times weekly a crisis board meeting that's all geared around this quick decision making of how do you implement those sanctions, how do you extract people that are in difficult situations, how do you deal with clients with concerns, how do you deal with all aspects of this immediate crisis. And in that decision structure, you also look at what are the sanctions really when they are, and do we have the implementation pathway to make sure that we deliver on them as soon as possible. You have to know that the repercussions of not meeting the requirements of a sanction are extremely high, so you really want to make sure that you do this right.
You just, in your introduction, showed also your Rabobank card. What are we noticing now in this financial
Rabobank.
system? Yeah, of the Rabobank, but also
More
other
generally.
banks. Yeah,
Yeah.
as clients of these big banks in the Netherlands.
And you mean with respect to the Ukraine crisis, or just in general the change that took place in Rabobank?
No, in response to this crisis in Eastern Europe, what are we noticing?
I think what we are noticing is the beginnings of doubt in consumers. We're seeing the increased commodity prices, food, energy, many price increases will translate in increased inflation. That triggers uncertainty.
Yeah.
You are seeing some supplies, some supply chains, manufacturing supply chains don't get their raw materials, so you're going to see some shocks that some products are not available, others are.
Yeah.
And so the impact of Ukraine on society will be via various angles. But I think the fear factor is the most dominant that will no doubt trigger a ripple effect. You've seen the discussion about a recession. We do not believe yet that there are signs that that's actually taking place. There is clearly a decline in growth rates as a result. But there have been people, and Ingrid Thijssen, the head of the VNO-NCW, has been quite vocal that she fears that it might lead to a recession. Earlier stages, when we had energy prices going up like this, they were always followed by a recession. So it's quite logical that people mention it. But so far, we do not see the immediate signs of it. But we do see an increase in inflation. We do see a slowdown of growth, and so our economists are also actively looking at how will this play out. And the reality is, and I don't know whether Roel is here, still there you go, he's a leading economist, but I noticed that economists generally use models to predict a pathway which is orderly. Right now it's all opinions. it's expert judgment, it's intellectual thinking, no models. And so we're really in a process of understanding collectively how could this unfold, scenario A, scenario B, and it's really thinking on your feet, which I think would be much more fun as an economist than working on your models, so to speak.
And these are some macro effects more, and is there still the consumer confidence in the banking system, even though these effects are here and you hear about them in the news?
I have no sign that there's any question about the banking system. We are now, and this is also different from 8 years ago, the buffers that the banking world are in some banks 8-fold, 10-fold higher than we came in already with a relatively high buffer into the crisis, the previous crisis.
Yeah.
And right now we've even doubled or tripled given then, and so the ratios of capital buffers are humongous. And so the first thing you do when you go into this crisis, you get scenarios looking at what could happen and how could it affect the buffers that banks have, and they're all deep in the green. So there's no reason to question any of that. There is reason to question the impact on the economy and how it will evolve further. And this we have to carefully look at, all of us, how we can avoid a deeper disaster than is already the humanitarian side of this disaster.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking of all of us, I think there will be a nice opportunity for audience questions regarding this topic. So if anyone has a question they want to ask Wiebe, please raise your hand.
Yes, here in the front on the left.
Yeah. Wait, let's say there's going to be a mic on its way.
Luxury. I do have a question, but it's more about something you said at the beginning of the interview. You were tapping into that the Rabobank, from the beginning, has this client base of poor farmers that started, and that you want to focus on the regional aspect and the personal contact in that sense. But nowadays we see this increasing trend towards digitalization and everything having to go faster, and this whole new client base that can basically sign a mortgage from behind their laptops. How do you tap into that or make the trade-off? How do you communicate with your clients? Because you have this increasing demand for digitalization, but also the risk that there's a backlash of your old clientele that's well, we want this more personal approach. We don't want this.
Yeah, no, and this is of course as a bank you follow where clients go, where society goes, and society wants to do digital, and so you follow. We are now one of the leading digital banks in the world. We've been recently listed in the top 10 leading digital banks of the world, the only Dutch bank. So this is not a mental image that we all have of Rabobank, that it's of the Dutch banks the only one that's in the top 10 of digital leading banks. But that's the reality. Clients want to be digital. And so what we've done is we've obviously made the journeys all digital. You can now do a mortgage digital, you have a spaarrekening, insurance, anything is digital. In fact, there's more digital on our app than any other bank in the Netherlands. So we've done the digital thing. But the trick is to then combine it with the connection at the individual level or the community level. So we've brought membership offers into the app. And we still have our local banks, our local member banks, so we still have more locations than all the other banks combined, and we still have more people that advise clients than most banks combined. So we combine personal with digital, and we engage our members with things that they care about, and they can influence the direction of the bank. So you try to use the digital contact world to augment the cooperative experience. What we've also done is that in the past, much of this cooperative was a local phenomenon. We're seeing with the sustainability drive, changing the food supply of the world, making it more sustainable, energy sustainability, housing sustainability. Most of these transitions are national, if not global, and we want to bring the cooperative feeling more together around these transitions, that you can work together with people that are like-minded, wanting to insulate their house, or wanting to create a cooperative solar panel company, or wanting to get to more sustainable food supply. We want to rebuild the cooperative feeling around those transitions, and not just the local, let's say, community initiatives only. And so we're migrating the cooperative to be more in tune with where society wants to go. and making it fully digital as well.
Thank you for your question. And the transition we'll get into in a bit, but I thought there was still one more audience question. All the way in the back.
Yes, thank you. Hey, good afternoon. Thank you for the talk. What impressed me when we talked about Ukraine is how multifaceted the things you said. You talked about economics, finance, and food supply, and many things, humanitarian, of course. And that made me think, like, I can imagine that you as a CEO, to make those decisions, you have to be very well informed, and I'm sure in Rabobank there are many experts writing many reports every day about all kinds of things. But I can also imagine that for you as a person, if you get too much information, if you read all the reports, it's way too much and you get overwhelmed, and maybe that also leads to bad decisions.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, you as a person, how do you sort of regulate the amount of information that goes in your head to make good decisions? And when do you maybe say to people around you, okay, just stop talking because my head is too full? How do you manage that as a person?
It's a very good question, because if I tell you the amount of pages I have to read as preparation of a board meeting, for example, you would all fall off your chairs. So the core skill you develop is really, well, you really want to know?
Yeah.
Well, on average, it's in the order of 1,200 pages for a board meeting. So it's, you really have to learn, and you, trust me, I'm not reading all of them, but they are there. And so the skill is to zoom in what is a subject where I really need to know the nitty-gritty, and it's on us to add value to a choice, and where is there really good preparatory work and they figured it out and they just wait for me to say go. And so you learn to prioritize the issues that you're faced with and zoom in on those issues where you know there is no consistency, there's no clarity, or it's a real dilemma, and you zoom in there. So you really have to learn to adapt your focus to where you matter most. It's quite easy to get lost in detail, like you described, if you think I'm important for everything. We have got fantastic people, in fact we need a lot more. So, but the fact that they are fantastic allows me to give trust that they can figure it out. And then you ask controlling questions, like have you looked at this, or have you tested alternatives, or have you looked at outside comparison? So I don't need to know all the details. I do want to know how it's been decided or how it's been analyzed. And that's the way you keep saying. But still, I mean, the amount of information you have to process is phenomenal. And when I speak to my wife Lisette every once in a while about what's going on in my day, she frequently says how amazed she is as how much you actually have to work on different chessboards at the same time. I love it. I mean, it keeps me alive and on my toes. But you have to like it. I mean, if you're stress sensitive, then this is not a job that you want to do, because there's always something happening. I love that, but you have to be equipped genetically to want it. And frankly, this is not a job that everybody should want. I didn't apply for it, so you're being asked to do it. And I think most of these leadership positions ought to be the ones where you're asked to do it, as opposed to. And so I'm drifting off your question, but I think it's an important message. These roles are not careerist roles. If you ever find a CEO that really wanted to be a CEO, I think there's something missing, because these roles are a burden on your calendar, on your life. It's not something like I'm dancing on a stage, then it's so fantastic, everybody wants to be a CEO. That's not credible. But
Not a nice PR talk for if you're going to leave in half a year and Rabobank has to get a new one, you're selling it.
I have one feature that is I'm brutally honest, so yeah, there's nothing else I can do. But it is a rewarding role. And I loved for example, the way Nelson Mandela talked about his presidency in South Africa. It's rewarding, it's fulfilling, it is valuable, but it's not something that you would say the best thing in life is to spend the days that I spent.
Yes. Thank you for the audience. We'll get back to the audience at a later point of the interview. We talked a bit about transitions a few moments ago, and one of the biggest transitions we have to face currently is the climate change crisis. It's not just on our doorstep anymore, it's already in the house. And we're wondering, what role does Rabobank take in this crisis?
We hope, and we certainly have an ambition to be a pathfinder in the transition to Paris for all of our clients. Illustration, this year we were the first bank in the world to report on the total footprint in CO2 emissions of all of our clients in our annual report. This is where the world needs to go, that you not only take responsibility for your own emissions, for the emissions that are related to your supply chain, but also that you are taking responsibility for how your clients work with your products and their emissions. This is part of the pathway to Paris. This is called category 3 emissions, and so scope 3. So we were the first to report the total footprint. That's the starting point of then having a conversation with your clients. How will you identify your road to Paris? And this is an ambition, but an ambition also has consequences. That most of my conversations with CEOs of large companies around the world are typically challenging conversations. I challenge them. If they don't lead on the road to Paris, we challenge. And obviously it's great to report that you serve the greenest companies and that your book is completely green, but frankly then you have no influence on the world. You have more influence on the world if you're capable of bringing society at large to Paris than if you isolate yourself into a little niche. We are rated as one of the most sustainable banks of the planet because we take that responsibility and we want to take it. But it's a hard thing to do. And let me give you a couple of examples why it's hard. We are financing the majority of the agricultural sector in the Netherlands. We are the proud financier and partner of what the farmers have delivered over the last 40 years. But now we need to be the proud partner of their transition towards fitting all of that into a small country. So it's a complicated journey where you help farmers through a difficult set of choices in a world where they don't get a lot of money for their product. They are faced with uncertainty. They're kicked around by policymakers, by public opinion, by everything is kicking them around, and they feel a loss of self-governance. And so you have to be a partner that cares for them, but also help them, support them, and provide them with a nudge every once in a while to say, no, step over this.
So you really see Rabobank as a leader in this, like pulling people along.
Absolutely.
With your loan portfolio,
yeah.
Bringing people to the future.
Yeah. And so let me give you a couple of examples why we're also innovating. And so one of the I love this as a new initiative that we took is we're building the Carbon Bank. And the Carbon Bank is actually a bank that starts to create a new infrastructure where the world can more freely connect those places where you can still capture CO2 in the ground by either alternative farming practices or forestry.
I was wondering
bring that to where there is no opportunity to do it.
Because in 2030 your ambition is to capture 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalents in the Carbon Bank.
Indeed.
But I saw that number, I was like, that is close to 2.5% of the world emissions currently. That is really ambitious. Like, how do you get there?
Well, you get there by not saying I'm going to do it on my own, but I'm building a system whereby this carbon can be traded. So when I go out into, for example, the negotiations in the United Nations or into the FAO, the food program in Rome, we are trying to build a system for the world in which we participate. So I want to have 2.5% of a system that I'm building with stakeholders in the world that we then only take 2.5% of. And so this is really you need to take a view on where does the system need to go, not just where do I want to sell products and then gradually get there. This is one of the reasons. The other reason is that we are pretty important in the world of food. And let me just give you an example or an indication. About almost up to half of the food that's been eaten in the world yesterday and today is touched by clients that Rabobank is privileged to help in some way or form. So half of the food that gets consumed is touched by clients that we in some way, shape or form have a relationship with. This gives an enormous opportunity to build those kinds of changes into the world where you really can make a system change, not just a new product for a new client.
In that system, who do you think are going to buy those credits? Like
well, there are many ways. For example, now we've got a wonderful pilot flank going. We can now monitor with satellites over Africa when we incentivize a smallholder farmer, a tiny farmer, to put 4 or 5 trees on his or her ground. They just have 2 hectares of farming land, but they generally do only 1 crop. And so we say, put 5 trees on your land, And then the satellite can monitor the growth of those trees and quantify the amount of CO2 captured in those trees. And then we can provide the smallholder farmer with a financial reward for those CO2s. So you're building a system whereby now I think we're reaching about 50,000 farmers, and we quickly can go up to 2 million farmers. And then you really have a reservoir of CO2 storage in Africa. And then you turn around and you go to, for example, major food companies in the world, Starbucks, Nestle, Unilever. They all have supply chains of food that they would love to see their supply chains be free of CO2 emissions. So we turn around and then we can offer this guaranteed CO2-free supply chains for them to bring to their clients. So you're bringing those two types of needs together.
But it seems to me like a bit of a waterbed effect. So like at a certain point you create more CO2 carbon capture, but that means that another company, so Starbucks or another company, can say, right, we just buy that plot, or we buy those credits, but then the rest of our chain we don't have to do anything.
No,
so it seems like it
I understand.
stifles.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Innovation.
It doesn't, because this is voluntary. So it's not part of the. It's where companies say, I want to be CO2 neutral. I can reduce as much as I can based on my own influence sphere. But then I look into my chain and I buy coffee from small farmers in Africa, and I want to make sure that that coffee is sustainable, or I want to make sure that the supply chain of that coffee is also sustainable. We can then offer them the service that this supply chain is actually guaranteed to be CO2 neutral, so that they are achieving their targets. It doesn't permit them to issue more or emit more elsewhere. That's the wrong kind of CO2 reduction that we wouldn't want to.
But how do you make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, because you actually engage with those clients. It's part of the conversation about how do you go to Paris. And if part of that, what they can do is they have done, and then they want to continue further by having a bigger influence on their supply chain, we can offer solutions so that they can actually clean their whole supply chain of CO2.
And you
But
mentioned, yeah?
Now, the good side of it is that where it goes, it's actually also a benefit. Right? So it's not that you're tapping or misusing something. We're creating for those smaller farmers, they don't even have the ownership of the land mostly. You create a sense of ownership, you give them a reward, you give them access to a financial system, they can get credits, so you also work on economic development in most of these parts of Africa. And this win-win solution is a new system that the world needs.
And you mentioned that it's what's important is also that it's a voluntary system.
Yeah.
I think if I look at myself and many people in the audience probably, that voluntary and multinational corporations and doing something about the climate, those three words they don't really go that well together in the past decades.
Indeed.
And what brings you the trust that a voluntary system will bring you to 1 gigaton in the future?
Well, to start with, we actually need the ETS system, the non-voluntary system, to be applicable to the whole world and to all sectors, and that's not the case. And so the reason that there is voluntary is because the ETS is not designed for what it should be, a global system for all sectors. And so there is an additional demand, and that is voluntary. What we're seeing is that many of the corporations are signing up to Paris. What happened in the COP 25 and 26 is a real commitment by the private sector that they want to bring the world to Paris. They've signed it. They've signed the Net Zero Financial Alliance, for example. They've signed all sorts of commitments where they say, I'm going to bring my supply chain to zero. So that's moved on, that's happened. So I think the old image of the private sector not caring about this issue and leaving it to the ETS system or to others is not applicable more to the leading companies. And if the leading companies don't do it, consumers increasingly demand it. So it's in anticipation of a stronger force that more of that will happen in the coming period, and that's what we're seeing. All of the major clients that we serve are caring about this, and all of them want some solution to this problem.
But then when we look to your portfolio, like last week you published your year report, and it says around the assets were more than 600 billion, and the newly provided loans were 400 million.
Yeah.
It seems like a drop in the bucket, because if you keep that going, for the moment you have a fully sustainable asset account, you're 140 years in the future.
Yeah, so there's the way it trickles into the whole balance sheet, and so our mission is to make the whole balance sheet go to Paris, and that's why we issued the report saying this is the footprint of, and we've now come up to 85% of the loan book, where we can estimate the environmental impact. So you bring it into all the loan products and all the services that the bank provides, there's now a requirement to report and talk about how you are going to go to Paris. And so it's not that it's only tied to the net new production, because there's many more new loans being issued than the 400 million. They have typically got a duration of about 3-5 years. So this whole loan book in 3 to 5 years is geared up. So 600 divided by 3 is a little bit more than 400 million. So there's much more being produced every year. But also the existing, you want to start with a discussion, how will you get to Paris? Because next year when your loan is up for renewal, we're going to ask you. And so this actually goes much further and much faster than just the incremental production that takes place.
Because these existing loans you have now, of course, are subject to risks which stem from the climate. And maybe for a bit of context, you split this in the financial world. We talk about this physical risk. So, for example, a mortgage for a house, and if there's flooding, well, then your mortgage is useless. And a transition risk, for example, a petrol station. If everybody drives an electric car, well, there's no use for a petrol station anymore. How are you dealing specifically with this physical transition risks in your existing portfolio right now?
So what you do is there's lots of categories of risk indicators, and a bank is very good at quantifying all sorts of risks. So what has come into the mix in the last years is quantified environmental risks in different categories. So you actually take a complete assessment of these transition risks, of operational risks related to climate, of default risks in sectors related to climate. And so you're making an estimate of the complete risk profile of your entire book. And that is part of the models that you then quantify, and you put a number on the total risk profile, and the banking stuff.
Yeah.
I don't want to bore you with that.
No, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Because why I ask this is due to the fact that the Rabobank is, well, we already talked about this, the bank that's very connected to agricultural production and also into the mortgages.
Yeah.
Is this not more important for you than for any other bank in this way? And are you not underestimating it in that way?
No, we're not underestimating it, because we now put a full number on the whole. But I see it as an opportunity, frankly, because if you quantify what the transition to the world needs, the investments that are needed to make a glass house more energy neutral, or a house more energy neutral, or a production factory more energy neutral, and you add up all the investments that it takes, there's actually a whole set of new banks hidden in all of these investments. So I see it as an opportunity to be a partner of the transition, more than of course there's risk. If you do nothing, it's risk. But if you step forward, it's an opportunity of enormous proportions.
And one of those new banks that took this opportunity, you could say, is Triodos Bank. We had the pleasure to have him 7 weeks ago on this exact stage. And we spoke to him about this as well, this transition and the role they play.
Yeah.
And the Triodos Bank over the past 10 years has doubled the amount of people that deposit their money in their bank.
Yes.
If you compare your bank to their bank, and your strategy and your vision on banking, and you see their growth, is the Rabobank strategy going to become obsolete, or is it just not sustainable?
Well, let me give you some numbers. We are about 100 times bigger than Triodos in green loans. So you have Triodos talk about how green they are, and then you multiply it by 100 and you get to where we are. So I don't think that we are not successful in being green. We are the biggest financier of offshore wind in Europe. We have by far the biggest loan book when it comes to the, for example, heat financing. So take any aspect of sustainable energy or a sustainable use of energy or new energy sources. There's not a single area where we're not at least 3 or 4 times bigger than the nearest competitor in that field. So we are there, and so I think where there's a difference in philosophy is we want to serve society at large and help society to Paris, not just the green parts of society. So yes, we are big in the greenest parts of society. We're the biggest, but actually it's more impactful if you want to engage those parts that are not yet green and help them to Paris. I think that's a much more responsible strategy than to isolate yourself on the green spots that are already there.
Are there things you can learn if you look at Triodos Bank, where you can take, like, we should take that into consideration or move towards,
No, well, I like them. So I like them. In fact, I love them because you see them identifying pathways, and they are very huggable in what they do, and they're very convinced about what they do. But you also have to look at the sustainability of the banking model itself, and look at whether you can do it the way they do it at the scale that we are. So we're learning a lot of them. I think they're frankly also learning a lot from us. And in many of the initiatives that we participate in, they partner. So I don't mind Triodos at all. I think they're a very nice and very positive vibing bank. But I think I care more deeply about helping society at large, and therefore the ambition is much bigger.
We touched on this earlier on in the interview, but the topic of regulation is extremely important, especially in the last years. Now Rabobank has almost 5,000 employees working on know your client, making sure that whatever the bank does is safe and controlled. Doesn't this cost stifle innovation, would you say, within the banking sector? And is it fair that this burden is actually placed on the banks themselves instead of by, for example, the regulator?
So are you talking about a specific area of regulation or just
general regulation, and then maybe later we can talk about climate regulation, but I'm just wondering about this world of regulation, if it doesn't stifle this innovation that a bank should provide in these transitions.
There's a lot of worry about regulation, and frankly I've not found a single regulator that actually wants the same thing that we should all want. And so for me it's quite easy to work with them and to say, well, I know where you're going because we want to go there too. It is important though that some of these regulations are not differentiating between large banks or small banks or startup banks versus established banks. Take for example the whole obligation of making the system safe against crime and financing of tourism, of terrorism, and all the requirements of anti-money laundering. I think it's important that everybody shares the burden of what it takes, not just put it on the shoulders of the regulator. We ought to take that's the law, but we should make sure that everybody participates. And right now, there are still some anomalies in that sense that a startup bank can have you wire 1 cent to the Rabobank, and that gives you the credibility for that bank so that you are controlled or checked.
Yeah.
That's not a fair share of the burden. But we have got a law in this country that says the banking institutions are the
gatekeepers.
The gatekeeper. I was looking for the Dutch word, but the huisartsen. But the gatekeepers of the financial system. And I think that's a good responsibility, but we have to do it in a way that is also doable.
And we regulate these financial risks, but these climate risks, we're also all carrying them together. Shouldn't we regulate these climate risks in the same way as these financial risks?
Yeah, but I think the cost of climate change are much bigger than the regulatory cost of climate change, if you get my drift. So on the one hand it's a big cost, on the other hand it's very small.
Yeah.
Let me get away from the question and do something else and then come back to the question. If you add up the total cost of climate change right now, and you would bring it down to an annual abonnement, it costs you as much as your Netflix account. I don't know, you have...
I have a Netflix account.
You have a Netflix account. Would you be willing to buy a clean planet for the same amount as you're buying your Netflix account?
Yes.
Yes. So if you add up all the numbers of climate change and you divide it by the cost of CO2 reduction, that's the number you get at. This is a highly doable thing. But we can make it very complicated if we then sort of put all sort of distrust and mistrust and regulation on top of it, so that you have to spend a lot of energy on the stuff surrounding it. If we can free up all that energy towards making it doable, we could easily carry this on, and the cost of regulation would not be an issue.
For the last 20 years, if it was that easy as the cost of a Netflix subscription, it hasn't seemed to be that easy.
No, because we make it almost insurmountable. In that sense, I love Al Gore, but I think what he left on our retina is an image of the world is coming to an end. And if you translate it then into very doable, concrete steps of what does it take to get my house insulated? Can I get a mortgage extension? Can I get a simple provider that can do the construction for me? Can I simplify the administration? Can I make it easy? If I buy something, if I buy my grocery at Albert Heijn, do I get a sign with the ticket that says your purchases have issued this much of CO2? Would you want to compensate it? Almost like when, I don't know where you guys fly, but you tick the box on CO2 reduction. That number is far too small, by the way, but I think we should get to a point where you're creating awareness in everything you do. What is the environmental footprint of what you've just done? And can we offer you a solution to either reduce it, compensate it, or do something good with it? And if we make it small, and that's what I think the role of a bank is, and certainly the role of the cooperative bank that I lead is providing very concrete, practical nudges to individual clients at the moment that they make a decision. That is the route forward, and then it becomes a Netflix account again. And right now it is not.
Because we need to, you say, offer this solutions
Yes.
more effectively and more accessibly to these clients. But shouldn't it be there somebody that should force these solutions to be there in place? I mean, because they're not appearing out of nowhere.
It depends on which world you like, and so far it's been very hard in democracies in the world to do
supply
it.
these solutions.
Well, the supply of solutions you can do, but so let me give you an example. We are now, when you are going to buy a house one day, I don't
If
know
we
where
can,
you,
if we
if
get
you
a
can,
mortgage from Rabobank.
if you get a mortgage from Rabobank, if you get a nice salary, a good job, and then you start thinking about a house. Let's get to that point. You are considering buying a house. What you're now getting is advice on the house that you want to buy of how well is it insulated, what does it take to make it CO2 neutral, which aannemers are around in the neighborhood to help you do the job, what is the time of cost to the cost, how will you discount on the mortgage will be reduced, what's the economic, we make it completely easy and transparent. It's almost a no-brainer, and we do it with every conversation. Only 25% of the people that are being offered this solution, it's all there, actually take it. So the real issue is not so much whether you force the offer, is how can you seduce the buy. If you bring the horse to the water, we are bringing the horse to the water, we have to find a way to make it drink. And that is the real challenge. So it's about awareness, it's about consciousness, it's about nudges, it's more of a change challenge than it is a organization of supply challenge, in my mind.
So speaking of bringing the horses to the water, you're going to be leaving Rabobank in the end of the year.
Yeah.
Will you be bringing horses to the water? Will you start a farm, or what are your plans?
Well, I used to have a horse, but no more. When I became CEO of Rabobank, I sold it. A huge Frisian horse, it was wonderful. And I rode it because my daughter did horse riding, and I said, if you're going to horse ride, I want to do something with you, so I started horse riding. But I had to abandon that as part of the CEO-ship. I have a little farm in Italy. And it's a very old farm, it's almost 200 years old in its foundation. And I'm rebuilding it to a level where it's reasonably livable.
CO2 neutral as well?
Absolutely CO2 neutral. In fact, completely solar panel energized. I can live off the grid if I wanted to. And I'm hoping to live off the grid for a couple of months.
What are you most proud of in the past years as CEO of Rabobank?
Oh, that's a hard one. I don't want to be in the mode of reflecting on my term.
You have a couple of months ago still.
Yes, and so I have this image of my daughter who won a rowing match, and I was there cycling with her, and I saw her that she only won the match because she kept on rowing to the last 100 meters and then won the race. I have that mental image, so I'm rowing towards the last 100 meters, and it's very difficult to look back at when you're racing to win a match.
Should we do another audience question?
Yes, one more audience question.
I think in the back right there was somebody who had their hand up in the last time as well.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon. I have two questions. So, in the
Keep
context
it
of
to one, please.
okay. So, in the context of the Eastern European crisis, you were talking about an even higher inflation rate and also a possible recession. So, how does Rabobank now diversify their clients' portfolios, and in what asset classes does Rabobank now invest in order to protect their clients' purchasing power?
So you have to remember that the war has now been going on for 3 weeks. And so I think what the general drift is, we don't know really how this will unfold and what the actual impact will be. We are starting to understand what it could be. But it's too early to massively respond yet to a base scenario of what will happen, frankly. So that's the technical answer to your question. We're not yet redirecting anything because it's too early to tell what really will happen, and it's too grave right now to care about long-term impacts. We have to focus on the short-term immediate impacts on lives of people and get them over here and provide a home where they can live. So the majority of our attention in this cooperative bank goes to, can we create places where they can sleep? Can we provide access to finance? Can we do very concrete short-term things? But then you also wonder, and one of the questions of wonder is, and I was this morning in a World Economic Forum conference, is about the question, how should the supply of food shift? Because we're building a global food system, in fact a global goods system, I would argue, that is very much just-in-time oriented, and it's not optimized for shocks. We're now experiencing a shock, and when the shock happens, a just-in-time supply system falls apart. So the question that we think is going to be raised is, how can we build a more stable supply where there are more buffers in the system so that you can absorb shocks? So one of the things that we will be doing is think about, where do we invest in warehousing, for example? Where in the world will there be needed more warehousing capacity so that there is more absorption capacity for shocks? All of this is questions for tomorrow, not for today.
Okay, one very short audience question still. Anyone front?
So first, thank you for the interview, thank you for coming here, and I would like to ask you, going back to crisis in Ukraine. So you said that now it is very difficult to say how the conflict will develop, but I would like to ask you whether Rabobank has any possible scenarios of the development of the conflict, and what will be the response of the bank to it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have the scenarios. We're developing scenarios of both the impact on the economy, impact on people and clients in the region, and impact on the inflation and development rate. And we're developing those as we speak. And I think it's too far-fetched to go through each of these scenarios and each of the responses that we would have. But that process is started. I think what you're seeing is that, like I said earlier when Roel was still in the room, this is still very much thinking of economists. How could this happen and how could that happen? One of the analyses that I loved, that I got this week, was where we take grain and look at how is grain, where is it used, where is it produced, how does the conflict affect particularly the grain supply, what can be the measures to compensate the immediate effect, and what will be the more structural effect to the grain supply of the world. And the same we do for sugar, and we do it for maize, and we do it for potash, and we do it for all ingredients in which the Eastern European countries, and particularly Ukraine and Russia, play such an important role. And then you try to understand what needs to shift. So we're doing it very meticulous, very precise in the area of food. And then when it comes to the economy in general, we're looking at more general economic indicators, inflation, unemployment, defaults on loans in the region. That's more macroeconomic thinking, I think. And that, I don't have ready yet what the responses to those macroeconomic. What you're doing, and Corona triggered that too. The regulation requires you to have an economic scenario. If it deteriorates, and that's happening right now, then you're automatically putting in reserves, some ever bigger buffers in your capital. So what I expect that will happen quite soon is that if the scenarios become solid, you start to generically raise the buffers for the absorption capacity of the outcome of the scenario. It's a more generic response in response to your question.
Speaking of that, to slowly round things up, in 2 weeks we'll have the Vice President of the ECB sitting right there, and as a banking director, I'm just very much wondering, what would you ask him?
Well, I think there's a lot of questions that were raised today that you should ask the central bankers, and how they, on the one hand, with the Corona crisis behind us, want to move away from the enormous liquidity splash that we put into the economy to absorb Corona, and they were just planning to release that. how they're going to integrate the Ukraine crisis into the next response. What does it do to the general mix of policies? I think they have, in Corona, actually went too far with too much liquidity, too low interest rates, in the assumption that consumers will spend when the interest rate is low. And we've seen that people don't spend more if the interest rate goes negative, they save more. So I think there's also a question that could say, have you reflected on the assumptions that you put into the policy mix in Corona, and how will it influence the policy mix when you reflect on Ukraine?
Yes.
Definitely think we
I
can
know
touch
that
on
this
topic.
audience can handle this kind of the complexity, because it's a
I
deeply
have
economic subject.
so very smart people in the audience, of course.
I can see that, yeah.
Thank you for being here, Wiebe. I want to also, for everyone else, in the coming weeks, next Monday we have Bastian Obermeier, an investigative journalist behind the Panama Papers. Then we'll have indeed the Vice President of the ECB, Luis de Guindos, at the end of March. And then we have the leader of the Dutch Farmers Citizen Party, Caroline van der Plas. That will be in Dutch the coming weeks. So come by, watch our social media, and give a warm round of applause for Wiebe Draijer.